everybody. It's Allison Williams here, your law firm mentor. Law Firm Mentor is a business coaching service for solo and small law firm attorneys. We help you grow your revenues, crush chaos in business, and make more money. All right. Hi, everybody. It's Allison Williams here, your law firm mentor. And this week, we are going to cover something on the podcast that I think is affecting a lot of people in ways that may seem pretty obvious and some ways that may seem a little less than obvious, which is the issue of what to do when you set a goal for the year and things happen that are beyond your control that take you off course. And so for those that are listening to this at some point in time in the future, we are talking about the global pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic that has struck the United States particularly hard in various different areas, really across the country, but in particular, certain areas have been very ill affected. And we know that in the legal profession, there have been a lot of law firms that have been doing very well in the pandemic, and others that have had a lot of retraction and are not doing well at all. So I wanted to give you guys a frame of reference for what to do when these types of situations happen, because even though, God willing, we're not going to have another global pandemic of this magnitude in our lifetime, we are certainly going to have economic recessions. We're going to have situations that happen in the course of business, in the course of law, and in the course of our own personal lives that could have a very deleterious impact on our law firms. And if we don't start thinking now about what to do when we get thrown way off course, and I'm not talking about just, we're a couple months behind, but there are some law firms that are 20, 30, 50% off in their revenue numbers. And what do you do with that? And what a lot of people have done with that is either stick their head in the sand and say, this is an awful year, we're just going to wait until coronavirus is gone and then hope to do better, or we're going to trudge through still aiming for the original goal. And if we don't hit it, we don't hit it, and that is what it is. And I don't think either approach is really the healthiest approach. And frankly, what I hear in the marketplace, what I see in the marketplace of what people are doing with that really doesn't give them a lot of sustainable options. They really, people are kind of talking about it in this abstract, think your way out, pray your way out, hustle your way out mindset that I think oftentimes really runs law firm owners into the ground. So today we're going to give you 3 concrete strategies. This is not big world ethereal stuff. This is digging into the weeds of your business so that you can start to turn course, even if the world around you seems to be headed in a direction that you're not happy with. And one of the things that I think is a particular bonus about this episode is that as we go through the strategies, I want you to actually put down, bring to the discussion. So press pause if you are out and about, or if you're jogging, or if you just don't have tools available to you, go get them. But you want to have a sheet of paper and pencil or pen handy for you. And you want to be taking notes. Reason is that we're going to tell you exactly what to do so that you have a stock of where you are now, and so that you can determine what your goals should be as you're going to create a goal for your fourth quarter, so that fourth quarter 2020 does not have to be the catastrophe that it may have been previous to this part of the year. All right, so let's get started. All right, strategy number 1 is that you need to take stock of where your firm is. Okay. Now, by take stock, I don't mean I want you to feel your way through how your business is doing. I don't want you to say yay or nay, good or bad. This is going to be a mathematical activity. Okay. So for those of you that don't like math, if you don't have a bookkeeper or you don't have an accountant, you're going to have to get a little uncomfortable to do this exercise. But frankly, being in business means knowing your numbers, and that is what this exercise is about. So the first thing you want to do is know how much money you have made year to date. Now, for some law firms, that's pretty easy. We just go into QuickBooks, or we go into our accounting software. You might be using Xero, you might be using Quicken, you might have it on an Excel spreadsheet, but all dollars in year to date, you need to know what that is, okay? Right now, we're just talking gross revenue. We're not talking net. We're talking about how many dollars year to date you have made in your law firm. Now, most law firms are on a cash basis, If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say cash basis versus accrual basis, this is not designed to be an accounting lesson, but most people calculate their dollars when they get them, not when they sell them. So if you have sold a service and not yet been paid and you are accounting for those dollars, you're on an accrual basis. We're talking about cash basis, okay? And we're doing that because, again, most law firms are on a cash basis. So you need to know how many dollars you have collected year to date. Dollars in, okay? Now, the next marker that you want to have is you want to know, based on how much you've collected year to date, what you are projecting to earn by the end of the year. Now, you might be saying, how do I figure that out? And this is actually pretty easy. So you can do it by either going by the number of months in the year or the number of weeks in the year. Okay, so you're going to take the total number, the total dollars that you collected year to date. Let's just go by months. Make it really simple math, okay? If you have collected $80,000 year to date, okay, and let's say, as of the date I'm recording this, we are actually in the first week of October. So I'm not going to do it by weeks. I'm going to do it by months. Let's say we're going through the end of September. Okay, so if we're doing this math by the end of September, we're going to take $80,000 and we're going to divide it by 9 months, because that's how many months that we have that contributed to that $80,000. And that gives us then an average of 88, 88, 88 in the year so far per month, okay? So again, 80,000 divided by 9 months, that gives us $8,888.88 year to date on average each month. If we multiply that by 12, that will tell us what our trend is for the rest of the year, okay? So that means if you were to multiply that monthly average figure out, you're going to have an annualized income of revenue total rather of $106,666.67. Now, why is it important to know that figure? Well, the first thing it tells you is what you're pacing to create by the end of the year. Now, we, of course, know that there are any number of variables, and depending on how money comes into your law firm, talking about cycles, right? If you get most of your money in the first quarter versus the second quarter, then looking at an annualized figure may not be the best metric for you. But if money tends to be relatively consistent, you might have an uptick in one quarter over another, but you're not having wild swings. Most of your revenue comes in consistently throughout the year based on how you sell. Then this is a good figure to tell you what you're trending to do by the end of the year. Now, there are lots of different ways to figure out what your trend is to the end of the year. If you're somebody that collects money in certain quarters and you collect 60% of your revenue in the first quarter, we could weight the amount of revenue that you got in the first quarter and then annualize the figures for the rest of the year. That gets a little complex. That really gets into more financial models that are a little more sophisticated than the average law firm owner is going to do on his or her own. Most of us would consult our accountant or our bookkeeper to help us with that type of specificity in calculating, but this is just ballparking. And one of the things that's really important for you to do as you start the process of understanding your numbers is to get into the habit of ballparking, so you have something that tells you whether you are off course or on course really quickly. Now, again, this is a starting point. This is by no means a final point, and this is certainly by no means the place where you ought to be making your financial decisions. But if you don't know what you are on track to create by the end of the year, it becomes really hard for you to measure your projected end run, meaning where you're going to end your year, comparing that to what your goal was for the year. And that actually is the next step in this process. So part 3 of this is asking yourself, how does the number that we are pacing to create by the end of the year compare with our 2020 goal? Now, for most law firm owners, there's going to be some level of resistance to do this because your mind is going to say, hey, 2020 wasn't what we expected. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to look at whether or not I created in 2020 what I planned to create at the beginning of the year because, Part of the year, we weren't allowed to be open in some states. Some parts of the country, lawyers were allowed to work, but work was restricted based on having to be remote. Some people had a much harder time becoming remote than others based on their use of technology before everything happened. So there are a lot of reasons, also known as excuses, as to why you might say, hey, I didn't get there and I'm not going to get there. So I'm not even going to evaluate whether or not I'm on track to get there. I know I'm not. Let's just leave it there. The reason why I don't think that that is a wise decision-making model for you in owning a law firm ever, but in particular in these times, is because numbers really are neutral. I know they don't feel like they're neutral sometimes. The number that is on paper, the number, if you did this exercise, that you reach is really going to make you feel like you have either done something wrong, not accomplished, not gotten what you wanted. Lots of reasons why you might not want to look at that number as a neutral number. You might want to look at it as good or bad. But you need to get into the habit of seeing numbers as neutral because numbers are data points, right? And that's part of the reason why I referenced earlier, right now we're just talking about revenue. Now, if your revenue went down 20%, but you laid off a third of your staff and ultimately are 25% more profitable, having lower revenue may or may not be a bad thing for you, right? Because you may have gotten leaner. And I know several law firm owners that have actually been able to do that. They've had a really hard look at their expenses and said, you know what? The way that we're burning through money makes sense when we have a lot of people and a lot of expenses and a lot of things that we want to accomplish. But when we are in a state of not knowing, we have to make sure that we prioritize the things that matter. And everything else really just has to be put on pause. So we're not going to spend money on a big fancy, firm retreat this year. We're not putting our money into nice imprinted letterhead right now. We're not going to add software licenses so that we can have some cute gizmos and gadgets for things that we don't know if we're going to use and don't really have the wherewithal to train on right now. So a lot of people decided that they were going to shift the way that they spend money, and they became more profitable even as they were experiencing lower revenue. So revenue, of course, is never the place where you end. It is the place where you start. But having an idea of what you thought you were going to create and asking yourself, did I get there or did I not? Always a good place for you to understand on the very basics. Did we overachieve, underachieve, or achieve our goals based on what we expected for the year? And now what are we going to do about that? Okay. So once you have these numbers, and once you understand that these numbers are neutral, you're in a place to be able to evaluate how you did this year, or rather how you are tracking to do this year. Because at some point, when we start looking at the goal for the fourth quarter of 2020, that's when we're really going to have to look at that first number, that comparative analysis of what was the pace for the year, where are we headed for the rest of 2020, and what did we plan to do for 2020, and asking yourself, where are we in the grand scheme of things? All right. Step number 2, this is the second strategy, okay? Once you have taken stock of where your firm is, the next thing you have to do is ask yourself, if you're not on track to meet your goals, why is that? But you also want to ask yourself, if you are on track to meet your goals, why is that? Now, this is an important analysis. And what we're really getting at when we asking ourselves these questions is, what is it that's leading to the current effects that we are experiencing in our law firms, right? So we know the law of cause and effect. We do certain things, they lead to certain outcomes. If we start to change the things that we are doing, then we will have a change in the effect that we are accomplishing. And some of those changes could be intentional acts that we put in place. And some of those things could be differentiated. They could candidly be things outside of our control, like COVID. So we don't want to assume under any circumstance that even if we have a major ripple effect in the world around us, our outer circumstances, that what we are creating in our business is solely as a result of those outer circumstances. They could be, but almost invariably, you are going to have some reaction to what happens in your outside world that is going to have a ripple effect in your business. And that happens no matter what the nature of the outside circumstance is. So I want you to think about something like a hurricane. If you live in an area of the United States where you experience hurricanes and a hurricane hits your area, and the month after the hurricane, you have a reduction in revenue, that could be because you stopped working for a period of time. So people stopped billing in the first month so that the next month there was less to collect. That could be as a result of your business being shut down. You might have been in an area that was affected in terms of its physicality, so you couldn't access your physical office. Maybe that impacted your ability to serve your clients. So if you're not serving in the first month, you're not collecting in the second month. Or it could be that you are not able to physically work because you are dealing with disaster planning, like evacuating the area or perhaps boarding up your physical location. There could be any number of reasons why you are not able to produce in a given month, and that could be related to the hurricane. But there could also be things that were within your control that you elected to do, consequential to the hurricane, that were not the direct cause of the hurricane. So consider situations where, let's say you have a small office. It's you and 2 employees, and 2 of your employees lost family members in the hurricane. They themselves were physically fine, but let's say they had close relatives that did not evacuate and succumbed to the hurricane. In that scenario, you may have decided that you were going to give them extended time off because they needed to grieve, they needed to take care of financial affairs, they needed to make sure that their families were okay. And if you decided to do that, that was a choice on your part. Now, it happened that you made that choice as a result of the hurricane, but it wasn't that the hurricane put you out of business, it was that you made choices that affected your business. Now, you might be saying, what difference does it make? Either way, I was out of business, or either way, I wasn't working. But the important thing is that most of us don't conceptualize that things that happen in our business are a result of choice. Almost instinctually, we go to the mindset of, if something is happening in the external world, we have no choice but to accept the ramifications of that in our law firm. And many times that is not true. Many times we are making choices that have adverse consequences for our business. And if we were to make a different choice, the consequence would be different. And so you have to start thinking about what exactly is the cause of the current circumstance that you're experiencing in your business, whether it's an uptick or a downward slide in business. Where did that come from? And what are all the pieces that contributed to that, so that you can start making different choices to change the outcome that you're experiencing? So I know that a lot of people in this current time have said COVID is the reason why business is what it is. So when you ask people, how are you doing? And they'll say, well, business is okay, but COVID. Or I'm not doing that great, and the reason why is COVID. And when you get that answer, I want you to recognize that that answer can be either an answer or an excuse. Now, I don't want you to think about this analysis of, is it an answer or is it an excuse, as being about blame. Because frankly, blame puts us into a negative mindset. And almost invariably, if we are blaming ourselves, we are not empowering ourselves to make different choices. We are wallowing in the negative choices or the less than perfect choices that we made. Not the goal here. The goal here is to look at our personal responsibility for what has happened in our business, so that we can take personal responsibility to change the outcome going forward. So you have to ask yourself, the way that you are looking at your circumstance, are we giving an answer of COVID when someone asks us what happened? And if so, is it purely an answer or is it an excuse? So let's look at the ways that we can differentiate them. If you give COVID as an answer, you could be saying, well, I looked at market consumption in my area before quarantine, we'll call it. And I looked at market consumption after my state required quarantine. I looked at the consumer price index in my area in the region where I practice law, and I saw that ultimately we had a dip in production in my area overall. I also looked at professions that are that my clients are typically in. And I noticed that those professions were industries that were greatly affected. So industries that had to completely shut down, like gyms and hair salons, the air industry, auto sales. And maybe in those areas, my clients were ill affected. So I had a great number of clients ill affected, which means I had a great number of payments either discontinue or drop off, and that affected my revenue. Now, in each of those scenarios, if you're looking at consumption of legal services in the area both before and after quarantine, you're looking at the consumer price index, and you're looking at professions that your clients have. In each of these, you see that there is a possibility of an answer being COVID or something else. So in other words, you could have had consumption in certain areas that you're in actually be higher based on the area that you're in, or it could have been static. There are very few places in the United States that had no economic change, but not every place in the United States had an economic downfall. Some places were relatively static, and some places actually experienced a slight uptick based on the types of jobs that inundated those areas. But regardless of where your area was, if you just gave the answer of, well, I looked and I saw, and it was based on a data point as opposed to a feeling or an assumption or guesswork or the news media, then you could say that your answer was actually an answer. In other words, you're not relying on COVID simply because that's the easiest thing to point to. You're actually doing an analytical process to reach the conclusion that COVID is the reason why your law firm is performing the way it is. But I'll give you another example in that same subset. If you're looking at the professions that your clients have, and you happen to have a lot of clients that are in home repair, maybe you have people that are installing pools or placing decks on homes, or household furnishings, or even outdoor furnishings, computers, a lot of those industries actually experienced an uptick as a result of the fact that now consumer buying has shifted consequential to COVID, meaning if people aren't able to go on vacations, they want to do things like buy RVs and put pools on their home, in the backyard. They want to be able to entertain their children differently. They need more technology because now people are working from home. So it's not always the obvious answer, i.e., quote unquote, COVID, that would make sense in your circumstance. And if you just rely on the obvious answer, you miss an opportunity to actually do the deep dive and the work that would tell you that the answer is something that you have more control over than what you might ultimately believe. Now, let's look at circumstances where COVID would be an excuse and not purely an answer. So let's say you don't know what your numbers are in your law firm, but everyone around you is singing the blues. Everyone is saying, times are tough, times are bad, it's really hard to sell, it's really hard to get people to buy. Or you could say, my phone is ringing less, so without looking at the time of the year or the trend in your law firm as to when your phone rings off the hook and when your phone is not ringing a whole lot, or without looking at services rendered, or even the type of marketing that you're doing and whether you made any changes to that, you say COVID. And another example would be if people in your law firm maybe had some difficulty coping. Some people could be parents and they could have had to immediately jump into homeschooling their children. You could also have had people that experienced depression, maybe when they were fearful about their health or experienced loss of a loved one. And they may have had some challenges coping with COVID. And as a result of that, when asked the question, well, what is the reason why your business had a downturn? You could say COVID with the expectation of, well, COVID affected my people and my people produce. So if my people are producing less because of the ramifications of COVID, I don't really have control over that. And one of the things that I want you to get into the mindset of thinking about, and this is really important, it is that even though you might not have control over the immediate circumstance, the big picture, right? We certainly don't have control over the global pandemic or people's behavior out in the public space. So if you're out in the public space and you're in an area where people are resistant to wearing masks, or if you are in a circumstance where your local government, because now our federal response is to defer to state response, if your state response is iffy and, to downplay the virus and its ramifications, and not requiring social distancing, not requiring limitations on crowds and things like that, all of those things you have no control over. But how you choose to respond to the various different implications of human behavior surrounding the event of COVID, you certainly have control over. So if you start to experience things such as people having challenges with technology, there's training that you can institute to get them up to speed. Or if you start to see that your phone is ringing less and one of your marketing verticals may be shut down, maybe you got a lot of clients through trade shows or public speaking, and now you can't do that in the way that you did before, there's always ways to shift online so that you can do your public speaking actually to a much larger audience in a public space as opposed to physically being present in that space. And, so a lot of these different strategies, you have to have yourself open to, one, the fact that you have the ultimate control to influence and contribute to the outcomes in your law firm. And if you don't believe that, if you have a mindset that says, when things happen to me, and a lot of us think COVID happened to us, when things happen to me, I have to accept those things and then move on. A lot of people shut down when that happens, because when something is happening, if you believe that it is happening to you, that puts you in a victim mindset, as opposed to things happening for you. So if you experience COVID as something that simply is, right? It is what it is. That's the circumstance. And what you believe about that is that you can look at what has happened to you and for you, and you choose to focus on what is happening for you instead of what is happening to you. This gives you the perfect opportunity to be able to expand your horizons to say, now that this is happening for me, what are the ways that I can make the best out of this and actually create something better in my law firm? So a lot of examples come to mind. One of our clients in Law Firm Mentor actually decided that she would start to create a Facebook Live show centered on her practice area of immigration. And so she goes live now 5 days a week. And after a precipitous drop in leads, she had 4 leads 1 week, down from an average of 20. And over 2 weeks of creating this show, she was able to get her leads back up over 20, meaning a 5-fold increase in leads and the opportunity to get her business back to where it was before this happened, as if COVID never happened in her law firm. But she was only able to do that. She was only able to create that outcome in her business as a result of saying, okay, something has happened. Now, what do I need to do? What can I do to respond to this? Rather than react to it, respond to it in a way that takes personal responsibility for the outcome that I want to achieve. So she wanted to achieve the outcome of having her business thrive and continue to meet her goals. And she was able to get there by virtue of shifting the narrative. Very important that the work that was done was not on, 1, blaming someone, 2, sitting down, stopping, going into the kind of mental tailspin that happens when these stressful events happen. But she was able to stop herself and redirect. And we were able to work with her on creating a strategy around her practice area so that she ultimately could get where she wanted to go. So after we've decided that we are going to take personal responsibility and accountability for the circumstances, or rather addressing the circumstances that befell our law firm in this day and age, the next thing that we have to do, the third strategy, once we've taken stock of ourselves, that was the first one, and we have decided that whatever happened, whether we are on track or not on track to meet our goals, we understand why. The next part of this, the third strategy, the key, is to take stock of where you as the business owner are. Now, you might be saying when you hear that, well, I already know where the business is, so I know where I am relative to the business. What more do I need to evaluate? But really, evaluating your business and evaluating yourself are two entirely different exercises. So in the business, we of course have all of the things that comprise the business. We have our marketing, we have our sales, we have our people, we have our systems, we have our finances, we have our communications. We have all of the glue that holds together the interweb of our clients receiving a certain service in a certain way from certain people. But when we look at ourselves as the key, the centerpiece of that business, right? The business is built around us. When we look at ourselves, we have to look at very different components to ourselves to optimize our performance relative to our business. So I want you to ask yourself, have you resigned yourself to having a bad year? Have you decided that based on where you are right now, 2020 is for shit, you're throwing in the towel, and you're going to wait until 2021 to actually pick up the gauntlet and start running again? Now, I hate to say it, but for those of you that have thought that, we have to acknowledge that COVID-19 will likely still be here in 2021, and we don't know when the terminal date will be for this pandemic being in our lives, meaning for our life as we know it to return to some modicum of what it was before, some ability to eat and restaurants at full capacity without concern, some ability to traverse the public spaces without masks, some ability for us to interface with other people without risk and concern and fear of whether or not that person is a carrier for this disease, some ability for us to go back to the types of activities that we loved without having restrictions imposed upon us. We don't know when that's going to be. But recognizing that we don't know when that's going to be is something that's actually very empowering for us when it's time to make decisions for our law firm, because if we have decided that we're going to wait it out, we can make another choice today. And for those of you that really in your heart of hearts have made that decision, even if you haven't verbalized it to anyone, I want to give you the opportunity today to reconsider that belief so that you can get into action and get your law firm moving. Now, still in the area of taking stock of where you are, ask yourself, have you succumbed to depression? Now, this is very important because mental health for lawyers is something that I think is not talked about enough. It is certainly something that we hide from because there are very severe ramifications if we're not okay. Because as soon as there's a possibility for us not being okay, we pose a risk to not handling a client matter the way we would like to. So a lot of us hide from issues such as depression, alcoholism, suicidality, drug use, and we don't come out of the shadows with those problems. And ultimately, what ends up happening is either we succumb to the problem and it does affect the client, or we simply stop working until the problem is resolved, when and if it ever gets resolved. And even though there are lawyer assistance programs in every state in the United States, we still have this mark of shame because we're in a profession that expects us to have our stuff together at all times. We are the leaders in many ways of our society. So I want you to really ask yourself if you are experiencing symptoms or signs of depression. Okay, and we're going to actually do an entire podcast episode about depression. One of my very good friends is going to come on. She's a psychologist who has had a decades-long career in treating a variety of symptoms, including the issue of depression. But for today, I just want you to ask yourself, if you're not familiar with the symptoms of depression, know that we can provide you that information. And if you have not seen a mental health counselor or professional, we would highly recommend that you do that. But it's important that you don't just think of that as sadness. If you are experiencing episodic sadness because of what's going on, because of the loss of life as we knew it, then I think that is a normal reaction. But it is the lingering in those negative emotions and it having a material impact on a sustained basis on your business that you really have to look out for. You should also ask yourself, have you decided to lower standards and expectations as a result of what's happening? Now, I know a lot of law firm owners actually think this is the way to go, that once we have experienced something as cataclysmic as COVID, what I need to be doing is going light on people, not expecting as many hours to be billed, not expecting as many clients to be served, not expecting the same time on desk to turn in our personal injury firms. And we think that that is giving people a reprieve. And to some degree, it may be. But in many instances, what we do by lowering our expectations is that the bar goes even lower than our lowered expectations, because you're signaling that you will expect and tolerate less. And that ultimately is what people rise to. People rise to the height of their performance, not to yours. So if you have a standard that says you need to produce a certain amount of money, you need to serve a certain number of clients, you need to be able to turn cases at a certain rate, and you take the foot off the gas and allow that to simply dissipate and accept whatever is given to you, or even some reduction in what's given to you, what tends to happen is people start to become educated that less is okay. And then that lower standard becomes a new cultural idiom. It becomes very challenging to move yourself back up. Now, if you're not producing the level of work in your law firm to be able to hold to the same standard for production that you had before, that's a different story. There are ways for you to keep the standard the same in terms of production, but allow for some modification of what will actually be produced. Meaning, if I don't have the work to give to a client, I could give the work into a marketing initiative, or I could give the work into a system for the firm, or I could give the work into pouring into the cultural morale. Depending on how high your standards are, ultimately that will dictate whether or not your standards should be modified. But if there's a modification, the modification should be a revamping of your structure, and it ought to have very clearly defined parameters around it. It should not be simply a wholesale walking away from the standards that you created. Now, what about this one? Have you pacified people with raises and bonuses when you don't have a plan to overcome the present financial circumstances? So this is a really important one, because I know a lot of law firm owners that have gotten a PPP loan. And for those of you that are listening to this, I'm relatively certain you know what the PPP is, but it is the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a component of the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid and... gosh, have I forgotten the name of it? CARES, Coronavirus Aid, resources, something. It's unfortunate I've forgotten the name of it, because I probably have done upwards of 6 webinars on this topic now. But we know that the CARES Act is the coronavirus legislation that was put into place by Congress shortly after the mandatory quarantine started in the early part of this year, that gave immediate assistance to small businesses that needed to have a safety net for keeping people employed while there was the mandatory quarantine in many states across the union. So for those of you that received a PPP loan, we're now at the stage where you can seek forgiveness of that loan through your financial institution. But as we go through that process, one of the things that I think is really important for people to understand is that when the legislation was initially proposed, the expectation was that this was going to be essentially, quote unquote, free money. But what has happened is that after money started to be allocated and was loaned out to various different businesses with the promise of forgiveness if they met certain criteria, then further discussion happened in Congress, and ultimately where we landed was that this money is not going to be taxed as income, but the expenses for which you would normally be able to deduct from your expenses at the end of the year to reduce your taxable income, it will not be included as a deductible expense. So if you took PPP money and put it on your payroll, you're not going to be taxed on the PPP money, but you are going to be taxed on the money that would normally be your payroll expense that would be deductible. So that means for all intents and purposes, that means that your PPP money is going to be taxable. So having said that, most law firms are going to have a much larger tax bill next year than they had this year. or at least than they were anticipating. And so if you are not tax planning right now for the ramifications of the PPP monies that you receive this year, that could be a big surprise next year, and that could cause an issue. Now, I say that only because I think a lot of people are trying to embolden their teams to know that the business owner is on your side, is looking out for you, is trying to keep you employed, is trying to keep things, all systems go. But if you are giving out raises and bonuses as if your revenue for this year, if you have not already paid the tax on the PPP, which most people, to my knowledge, based on what I'm hearing out of the streets, have not done, then you're going to have less money available next year, even though you are committing to a higher expense for your team. Now, this is not for me to discourage you from still giving raises and bonuses, but it really is to educate you on making sure that you are taking stock of where you are. That means not just, am I making appropriate financial provision for my law firm, but am I doing what's necessary? Am I really doing what's necessary in order to make sure that I'm not making decisions based on what feels good? Meaning, I need to feel like I am still the generous leader that I was before, or I need to feel like I'm not depriving anybody, or I need to feel like the good guy who's taking care of people as they are scared because of what's happened to our economy in the time of coronavirus. If you are doing that because you need to feel satiated for yourself, you are missing a golden opportunity to be a true leader and to make your decisions about what is available to give to others based on what is your projected revenue for your law firm. Okay. Now, that is not about going into a lack mindset and saying, oh my God, we had an economic consequence, so therefore I can't afford, right? We don't want you to be reactionary in the opposite direction any more than you're going to be reactionary in a positive direction. But your goal is to be fully educated and to make decisions that are best for your business based on your business metrics and separating your emotional connection to those decisions from the analysis. And this is where taking stock of yourself and why you are doing what you are doing is very important. Now, the last question I want to ask you is pretty matter of fact. Simply, have you given up? Meaning, have you taken a look at what has happened this year and whether it's good or bad, decided you are just going to ride it out, hold steady, hope for the best, etc.? Now, I'm asking you that because I want you to be really clear on the fact that standing still means moving backward, because time and life are always moving forward with or without you. Now, if you have found yourself on the negative side of any of these questions that we've talked about today, there is still time for you to have an amazing fourth quarter. There is still time for you to start anew. It is never too late. So what do you have to do? You have to decide on a goal, stretch it, speak life into it for you and for your team, and rise to the challenge of believing that it's possible. I'm Allison Williams, your law firm mentor, everyone. Have a great week. Thank you for tuning in to the Crushing Chaos with Law Firm Mentor podcast. To learn more about today's guest and take advantage of the resources mentioned, check out our show notes. And if you own a solo or small law firm and are looking for guidance, advice, or simply support on your journey to create a law firm that runs without you, join us in the Law Firm Mentor Movement free Facebook group. There, you can access our free trainings on improving collections in law firms, meeting billable hours, and join the movement of thousands of law firm owners across the country who want to crush chaos in their law firms and make more money. I'm Allison Williams, your law firm mentor. Have a great day.